Hey, good morning, family.
Good morning.
How are you guys doing this morning?
Great.
Good. Feeling pretty good?
Woo!
Right.
Yes.
It's Sunday morning. Yeah, summer. Well, it's good to see you. I'm glad to be here. Glad to see all of you guys this morning. All of you guys have been enjoying your weekend, finding a way to enjoy a little bit of the summer in between the pockets of rain that we seem to have every single day. I'm really trying to paint my deck, and I don't know how to paint my deck because it's like I get an hour of rain and then it's wet. And I have to wait another 2 days for the deck to come out. So, Scotty, you can give me some advice on that. All right, and that's about it. So, perfect. Thanks. As Tessa mentioned, don't forget that it is her last Sunday, so make sure to give her some love today. And then also don't forget that we've got the going away party this evening at 7 p.m. over at my house. So it's going to be a good time to wish Tessa well as she goes on her new wonderful and fun adventure. So I'm very excited for that. We're going to be jumping back into Galatians this morning. We're going to be jumping into Galatians 4. And again, we're diving right into the middle of this argument that really has been going on since we started this whole book. You know, Paul is trying to really passionately argue against this notion that the Galatian church has been falling into about subjecting themselves to the Mosaic law. So there's this particular religious group that was continuing to preach that there's this righteousness that is based on following the law, on doing it just right, and doing it this way, and again, following everything that's in the Old Testament laws. And you can really, if you think about it, you can see how this group, they were known as the Judaizers, you can see how they might have felt kind of spiritually superior to the other Christians because they were doing so much more. They were putting in so much more work because they were following all these laws and doing all this stuff. You can see how they might have felt that, we're just better because we're doing so much more for God than anybody else. But again, throughout this whole book, Paul has been really fighting and really arguing hard against this mindset. And as we open up in Galatians 4 this morning, again, he's going to bring up some kind of theological points. He's going to continue his appeal to help them see again that this is not the life, this is not the mindset that they should be in for their relationship with God. He's going to continue to build on the work that he's put down over the previous chapter. So Galatians chapter 4, verse 1 here. It says, "What I'm saying is that as long as an heir is underage, he's no different from a slave, although he owns the whole estate. The heir is subject to guardians and trustees until the time set by his father. So also when we were underage, we were in slavery under the elemental spiritual forces of the world. But when the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. Because you are his sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but God's child. And since you are his child, God has also made you an heir." So in this kind of almost confusing passage, Paul is trying to remind the Galatians about what God has done for them. And he does it kind of in an interesting way. He talks about how when we were kind of underage, he uses this analogy of underage into adulthood, and kind of when we were spiritually underage, that we were in slavery under the elemental spiritual forces of the world. And it's a bit of a strange wording, but what he's trying to get across is that we were stuck by and trapped by kind of the basic principles of the way the world works. Think about it as like the ABCs of the way the universe works, the way the world works, the basics. So for example, let's take for example as part of it, one that we can expand upon is the law of cause and effect. Right? That's a law that we are bound by in many ways, that when we do this thing will happen. If we don't do that thing, then this thing will happen or won't happen. And in some ways that law kind of dictates in our mindsets that if we do good, then good will result, and that we deserve good. And then if we do bad, then bad things will happen and we deserve bad. It's kind of this idea that permeates a lot of the way we think and a lot of the way that we live. And the problem with it is in our relationship with God, this is what the Galatian churches were struggling with. And this is what the Judaizers were trying to put onto the Galatian Christians, is that this idea of cause and effect applies directly to a relationship with God. So what you need to do is just do this thing, do the law, and then you do the law well, and then you will deserve good, right? Good will come to you. And if you don't do the law, then bad things will come to you. And in a lot of ways, that was the way that it worked in the Old Testament, right? You did these things just right, and good things would happen. And then if you did things bad, then there were some pretty swift and harsh consequences, right? But the beauty of what Paul is trying to get across and help the Galatians to see is, in fact, because of Jesus' sacrifice for us, the law of cause and effect no longer applies to our relationship with God. Because the reality is that we no longer get what we deserve because of Jesus. And that's actually amazing news, because you know what we deserve? Death and destruction and despair because of our sin. But we don't get what we deserve anymore. Instead, God offers us adoption to sonship. God offers us the chance to be His children, to have an intimate and close and real relationship with Him. We have the right to become heirs to His promise, though we don't deserve it even a little bit. Not at all. And it's this understanding that is one of the most exciting pieces of Christianity. It's what makes Christianity so great. It's not this kind of karma-based system, but it's this gift of a relationship with an amazing God who loves us and cares for us and offers us His amazing grace, though we have absolutely no right to have it, no claim to it whatsoever. But the Galatians, again, were struggling with this idea that they could establish their own system, that they could establish their own way in which they could earn and they could deserve the adoption, that they could deserve this awesome relationship with God by doing these things, that they could do enough to deserve what God offers. And so Paul continues to rail against that idea, and as you get throughout this chapter, we're not going to read the whole thing, but as you keep reading throughout the chapter, he gets more and more frustrated. You can see it in the way that he writes. He's so upset about what the Galatians are falling into. We'll see a little bit about that here in Galatians 4, verse 8 now. It says, "Formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those by nature who by nature are not God's. But now that you know God, or rather that you are known by God, how is it that you're turning back to these weak and miserable forces? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? You're observing special days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that somehow I have wasted my efforts on you." So again, you can see Paul getting frustrated. It's like, oh my gosh, why would you go back to this miserable and weak and terrible system when Jesus came to free you from all of that? It's just like, I can't believe it. It's like I've wasted my time trying to help you see the gospel because you're falling back to this thing that's so ridiculous. So the Galatians had forgotten the slavery. They'd forgotten the slavery that they had been redeemed from, and they were turning back to the basics that they knew before they knew God. And really, as we read about it today, and we think about like the idea of going back to the Mosaic Law and so on and so forth, in our minds, that's such a ridiculous notion, right? So it's easy for us to be like, come on, guys, come on, Galatians, like, what's wrong with you? That's so dumb. But we all do it. We all do it. We all struggle with that same notion of turning back. We all forget sometimes how awesome God's grace is. We all forget how awesome the offer that He extends to us is. And when we do, when we forget, we turn back. We turn back to what we know before we knew God. What do you turn back to when you're struggling in your faith? What's that thing that you knew that you just so easily slide back to? The Galatians, they knew the law, right? Many of them knew the law, and so it was easy for them to slide back to the law, trying to earn it themselves, right? But what about you? When your faith is weak, what do you turn to? Right? I think our culture, certainly right now, is not a culture that would embrace going back to Mosaic law by any stretch of the imagination. But we're certainly not above going back to checking the boxes. We're certainly not above going back to going through the motions or just looking the part of Christianity. Right? Or maybe it's something totally different for you that you turn back to. Maybe you go back to seeking your own comfort above all else. That it's just about you. You don't want to stretch yourself, and you don't want to try or persevere. You just do what's comfortable and easier for you. Or maybe you turn back to nothing. And maybe that's where you came from, is no faith, no background, and so you just go back to a place where, yeah, nothing matters at all. I'm just going to do what I want to do when I want to do it, and I don't even care. I think one of the bigger things that we struggle with as a culture today is the desire to turn back to the mindset of complete tolerance in a way that just completely blurs all the lines between right and wrong, and encourages this sort of subjective righteousness wherein, you know what, you do it differently than I do, but it's just all good. We're all going to the same place, and it's all okay. No matter what you do, it's good. Because what happens, and what has happened in our culture so often, is to tell anybody that they're wrong, like objectively you're wrong, or objectively you're off the path, right? That has become controlling and manipulative and bad. It's like, oh, you can't tell me that I'm wrong because this is how I see it, and my right not be the same as your right. And it just, again, we struggle with this huge, like, everybody's okay mindset. Super tolerance, super acceptance, super everything is, but that's not the way it's supposed to be. But I think it's something that's very easy to turn back to, especially in today's day and age. And again, maybe that's not you, but again, what is it for you? What do you turn back to? Really, this is the place that we need to get, is to think about this a different way. So when Jesus had his ministry, and when Jesus had some really, really tough things to say, there's a particular point in John chapter 6 where he has some really, really difficult things to say. Many of his disciples are like, I can't handle that, so they're peacing out, right? But Peter has this really amazing response, and this is the response that I want to emulate. It's in John chapter 6, verse 66. It says, from this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. You do not want to leave too, do you? Jesus asked the 12. Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. You have come to believe, we have come to believe, and to know that you are the Holy One of God. Sometimes we struggle in our faith. Sometimes we have that temptation to turn back to what we knew. But this is where I want to get. This is the place where I want to be. Even when everything in my body tells me to turn back. Say, I'm done with this, I'm fed up, I'm tired, I'm cranky, whatever. I want to be able to get to the mindset where I come back to this question. To whom shall I go? Where else would I go? Recognizing that it is only Christ that has the words of eternal life. Recognizing that he alone is the true Son of God, the Holy One of God, and realizing that it is ridiculous. It's crazy to turn back. And that's my encouragement for you this morning. Realize what Christ offers you, and realize that there is nothing and no one that could possibly offer anything even remotely close to what Jesus offers you. They couldn't offer anything anywhere near the ballpark. That awesome offer of grace that Paul was focused on at the beginning of the chapter. That we're not in slavery to the elemental spiritual forces, but we can totally see things differently. Of getting this most precious gift that you and I most definitely do not deserve at all. Use that mindset, use that thought to help you resist, to help you fight that temptation to turn back, and instead turn to Jesus and live for him. Amen?